Tonight is my honor to introduce our guest, Lawrence Lessig, the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law and Leadership at Harvard Law School. Professor Lessig has participated in and even led many organizations and movements for civil rights and legal reforms. In fact, he's done so many that if I were to list them all now, he'd probably start one before I finished. Instead, I'll give a few highlights. In 2001, he co-founded the Creative Commons to expand the number of publicly accessible works. He's a supporter of net neutrality, and in 2006, he testified to the Senate in favor of greater digital rights. And since 2010, Lessig has had the grand and most honorable ambition to use Article 5 of the Constitution to assemble a second constitutional convention. I, for one, hope he succeeds. He has worked on campaign finance reform as a defining issue of our government, going so far as to run for the Democratic nomination in 2016 on passing the Citizen Equality Act to keep money out of politics and prevent gerrymandering and voter suppression. In between these efforts, he has found time to write 10 books on legal issues, ranging from the regulation of the internet to campaign finance reform. He is here to speak about his most recent work, They Don't Represent Us, Reclaiming Our Democracy. In They Don't Represent Us, Lessig first analyzes, then diagnoses the ills of our democracy, particularly our institutions giving preferential treatment to the special interests over our own citizens. But Lessig isn't simply content criticizing our government. Instead, he opts to offer a set of solutions: public campaign funding, reconfiguration of the Electoral College, an end to gerrymandering, senatorial reform, penalties for states that engage in voter suppression, and even new institutions to give a greater voice to the people. So please help me give a warm welcome to Professor Lawrence Lessig.
So I'm so excited to be here. The truth is, I've always wanted to be here, and I've written book after book waiting for the chance to come. And now that that's happened, I'm kind of finished. I'm no more writing books, because why would one ever do it again? Okay, so this book, They Don't Represent Us, intentionally ambiguates the claim in the title. So in one sense, by they don't represent us, I'm talking about them, meaning the government doesn't represent us. But in addition to the government not representing us, a fight that I've been engaged in for the last 12 years, I also want to suggest the way in which focusing on us, as in we the people, we don't represent us. The way that they are unrepresentative is obvious, I think. The way that we are unrepresentative is not obvious. And my view is, as important as it is to solve their problems, our problems are actually worse. So let's start with them. The framers of our Constitution gave us a republic, as many conservatives will insist again and again when you talk about our democracy. It's not a democracy, they'll say, it's a republic. But by a republic, our framers meant a, quote, representative democracy. And by a representative democracy, it's kind of in the title, what they meant was a democracy that would be representative. But our representative democracy is not representative, and it is unrepresentative because it has rendered us unequal as citizens in any number of ways. So I just want to go through 4 dimensions of that inequality. First, think about the equality to vote in America. Do we have an equal vote in America, an equal freedom to vote in America? And the answer to that is obviously no, because we allow states to set their rules in a way that suppresses the opportunity of the party that happens not to be in power to participate in those elections. Typically, that renders in racial terms, so white government officials in Georgia make it harder for black people in Georgia to vote by removing voting machines or changing the voting lists in ways that makes it more difficult to participate. But that may be racially motivated, it may just be politically motivated, but whatever way it's motivated, votes are effectively suppressed because we allow this inequality to reign within our democracy. Charles Stewart at MIT estimates that it's probably 16 million people in the last election who effectively had their vote suppressed by allowing these techniques to occur. Or do we have an equal freedom to vote for president? Many people look at the Electoral College and say, obviously not. But the truth is, it's not directly the Electoral College. It's the fact that states have adopted something called winner-take-all for allocating the electors in their state. So all but 2 states say the winner of the popular vote, even by just one, gets all of the electors in that state. Which means that though most people think this is the country that elects our president, the truth is it's swing state America that elects our president. Because in these states, swing states, states that could go one way or the other, these are the only states where it makes sense to campaign if you're a presidential candidate, because all of the other states are already determined. So what that means is that, for example, in 2016, 95% of candidates' time and 99% of campaign spending was in these 14 states. These 14 states, then, are the states our presidential candidates are trying to woo. But the truth is, these swingers do not represent America. They are older, they are whiter, their industry is kind of late 19th century industry. There are 7.5 times the number of people in America who are in solar energy as mine coal. But you never hear about solar energy in a presidential election because those people live in Texas and California. What you hear about is coal mining, because coal miners are in these swing states. So if you think about the fact that the non-swing states just do not matter, or even the minority in a swing state goes to vote just to have his or her vote thrown away, the aggregate is probably about 85 million people who went to vote in the last election to have their vote just not count. Or think about the way we gerrymander districts in the House of Representatives, a system whereby politicians pick the voters as opposed to the voters picking the politicians. What we know about the strategy of gerrymandering is that the states who are drawing these districts are trying to make the seats in Congress safe seats, so that the representative knows which party is going to prevail. So there are safe seat Republican districts and safe seat Democratic districts. Probably 85% of Congress is properly considered safe seats in this sense. But what this process is, as they draw these districts, Christopher Ingraham calls these crimes against geography, to craft these safe seats, is a dynamic that produces a very obvious incentive. If you are a Republican in a safe seat Republican district, you're not worried about any Democrat challenging you and beating you. What you're worried about is a Republican challenging you and beating you in the primary. But what we know about primaries is they attract the most extreme voters in either party. So you're worried about an even more right-wing Republican challenging you and beating you. Or if you're a Democrat in a safe seat Democratic district, you're not worried about a Republican beating you. You're worried about an even more progressive Democrat beating you, which means that 85% of the seats, what these representatives are doing is focusing to their flanks, focusing to the extremes to make sure they keep the extremes happy. Now, I'm kind of an extremist, so I'm not so upset about that in absolute terms. But the point is, the rest of America, the America that is not the extremes, finds their votes systematically underrepresented in a system like this. And if you take those non-extremists and then those who happen to live in a minority district where they happen to be a Republican in a safe seat Democratic district or a Democrat in a safe seat Republican district, this system of empowering the extremes means that in the last election, 89 million Americans went to vote to have their vote just not count. But the most extreme, the most outrageous, the issue which I have spent so much of my time fighting about is the way that we fund campaigns in America. We take it for granted that campaigns will be privately funded, which means that candidates for Congress and representatives in Congress have to spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time dialing for dollars. Sometimes I have to explain to my students that's a telephone. It's obvious to maybe many here. Dialing for dollars, calling people to raise the money, sucking up to people to raise the money they need to get back to Congress. But who are they calling? They're not calling the average American. They're calling no more than 120,000 Americans who happen to be in the class of people who help them to fund campaigns. 120,000, this tiny fraction of the 1% that they're sucking up to fund their campaigns. This dynamic has an effect on them. They develop, as they do this, a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do will affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shape-shifters, as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money, not on issues 1 to 10, but in issues 11 to 1,000. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, always lean to the green. And then to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. So the point is that the people who are the funders here are the important people in this dimension, which means that about 139.5 million people go to the polls not to have their vote matter. And indeed, I have to take this guy and cut off 4/5 of his body to get down to the actual proportion of those who just don't matter. So when you add all these things up, the point is just as obvious as mud. They don't represent us because we've allowed this inequality to pervade every dimension of our democratic system. And the consequences are profound. This study by Princeton political scientists, then Princeton, Martin Gillens and Ben Page, which is Princeton, I'm going to put that off the stage as quickly as I can, is the largest empirical study of actual decisions of our government in the history of political science, relating those decisions to the economic elite, attitudes of the economic elite, attitudes of organized interest groups, and attitudes of the average voter. And what they found with the economic elite was, as the percentage of the elite who support something goes up, the probability of that being passed goes up as well. That's the way you'd expect it. The more who support something, the more likely it is it gets passed. So 0%, 0 chance it's being passed, 100%, 35% chance it is being passed. Here's the graph for organized interest groups, the same dynamic. The more who support it, the more likely it is that it gets passed. Here's the graph of the average citizens. That's a flat line, literally and figuratively. What that's saying is it doesn't matter the percentage of average citizens who support something. It doesn't change the probability of that thing having been enacted. As they put it when they describe it in English, when the preferences of the economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy in a democracy. The average citizen's views just don't matter. When I was growing up, we had this image of democracy. There we are, we kind of middle America, we the people driving the bus here. But here's the reality of our democracy. The steering wheel has become detached from this bus because of this systemic inequality we've allowed to grow within our democracy. Now, the Gillens and Page study has been criticized by some, so let's just at least say this. At the very least, it is because of this inequality that we can see the rise of what Francis Fukuyama calls a veto-ocracy, a vetocracy. Fukuyama points to our framers and says, look, they built a very delicate, almost Swiss watch-like system of government with checks and balances and mechanisms to slow down what our government does, to make sure that when our government acts, it really acts in the interest of the people. But these inequalities are like dripping molasses into the mechanisms of that Swiss watch. Because these inequalities mean that the tiniest number of important elements, whether it's money or extremists or those whose votes are not suppressed, have the capacity to block change. And what that has led to is a reality we need to openly and honestly acknowledge, that in our three-branch system of government, there is a failed branch. That failed branch is Congress. You might have views about the president. We can bracket that for a moment. But the branch that does not function, the branch that has lost its capacity to function because of this vetocracy, is Congress. Okay, that's the problem with them. I want to introduce the problem with us in a way that's a little bit focused on the salient issues of our moment. So the 17th president of the United States, Andrew Johnson, was the first president to be impeached. When he was impeached, media was like this: newspapers. And that public media was fragmented and partisan. Yet the views of the public that was produced by that fragmented and partisan media were invisible. Polling did not exist. People dreamed about it. James Bryce, in his book, The American Commonwealth, in 1888, writes, a final stage in the evolution of democracy would be reached, quote, if the will of the majority of citizens were to become ascertainable at all times. How wonderful it would be to be able to push a button and know what the public thinks. But not yet. In 1868, did they have that capacity. In 1868, the public was illegible. And if you stood up and you said, what do the people think? It was a kind of laughable question to be presented in any public policy circle. So when Andrew Johnson was impeached, he was impeached with a public that was fragmented and illegible, as opposed to a public that would be concentrated and legible. Okay, as the 19th century moved into the 20th century, technology changed. Indeed, technologies changed. The first of these changing technologies was the technology of broadcasting, a technology to make it so that many could hear at one time the very same thing. Of course, what they listened to was not always wonderful, but it was sometimes wonderful. FDR used the radio to knit together the nation, to tell them the stories both of the recovery that he was promising and the war that he was trying to wage successfully. 1939, 60% of Americans reported getting their news through the radio. By 44, that number was up to 74%. Now, in this story, all broadcasting is important, but the most important broadcasting here is television. As Marcus Pryor of Princeton describes, I've got this obsession about Princeton, I don't know what that is, describes in his extraordinary book, Broadcast Democracy, television changed everything. Not just because of the concentration in the stations. Even in 1977, 90% report getting their news from just 3 networks. But also because of the addictiveness of this technology. It's irresistible. The television is turned on and just kept on. But because it's video, it's understandable, and therefore, in an important way, egalitarian across the full range of society. As Breyer shows in his data, more citizens become engaged in politics because they are engaged in mainstream trusted sources. There's a daily lesson that they get every night on the news, and the news is on the same time on all 3 networks. Lessons from people like this, building a common understanding, a thick common understanding. And it's on the basis of that common understanding that there is increased political engagement across the range of American politics and the progress that we associate with that period in American history, whether it's civil rights or the war in Vietnam or the impeachment of Richard Nixon or the environment. So this is change 1, what Pryor calls the change to broadcast democracy between 1950 and 1985. But change 2 is a coincidence that most theorists miss and most of us are likely to miss. The coincidence is this. At the time that broadcasting is taking off, polling is invented. 1936 is the critical moment in this progress. In that election, the then dominant way of measuring public opinion, a kind of straw poll conducted by the Literary Digest, predicted that Alf Landon was going to beat FDR by 20 points. Now, the Literary Digest had been spot on with the Electoral College results in many elections before, and so they were pretty confident that they knew who the new president would be, and it was a man named Alf Landon. Now, you know, because you might not even know the name Alf Landon, they were wrong. But at the time, a man named George Gallup told them they were wrong. George Gallup said, I've talked to 1,000 people. They had collected 3 million ballots. But he said, I've talked to 1,000 people, and I can tell you not only will Alf Landon not win, but FDR will win with an extraordinary landslide. And everyone laughed until, of course, FDR won with the largest landslide in the history of contested presidential elections in the Republic. So this idea, which Bryce had fantasized about, the final stage of democracy, had been born because we now had a scientific technology with which we could know what the people thought. Okay, so here's the key to the point I want you to see. When polling was born, it was born to a very special public. It's a happy coincidence that we learned how to read the people just when the people have something smart to say. And the people have something smart to say because they knew a common set of facts. And based on that knowledge, they progressed. Now, a common set of facts. I don't mean unbiased. I don't mean complete. I don't mean it covered everything it should have been covering. I'm not even saying what it covered was true. I'm just saying it was in common that these facts were understood. And based on that common understanding, there was the progress we see during the age called broadcast democracy. Now, both of these technologies are important, critically important, to the fate of the 37th president of the United States, the almost second impeachment case of Richard Nixon. Because as ABC, NBC, and CBS told the story of the Watergate hearings, and as shows like 60 Minutes went in depth to unpack exactly what had happened in Watergate, America listened. They couldn't help but listening. That's all that was on. And as they were listening, they learned something. And as they learned something, they were read through polling. The legible public spoke back and told the policymakers what they thought of the facts as they were developing. And the critical thing to notice is the extraordinary correlation between the views of Republicans and views of Democrats as this story develops. At the top of the red line are the Republican views. As with Donald Trump, it's about in the 80% supporting Nixon all the way until about 6 months before his resignation. And the Democrats are lower, higher than they are with Trump, but lower. But notice how both lines move together. And they both fall at the same time. And that's because we were one nation listening to one story which had one consequence, that this president had to resign. So in the impeachment of Richard Nixon, it is a concentrated media environment with a legible public that produces the influence that drives that president to resign the presidency. Okay, so the 20th century evolves to the 21st century, and of course, technology changes again. First, cable television changes. So this graph tries to capture it. This is dark lines, the market share of the big three. They go from about just under 70% in 1985 to under 40% by 2002. The white lines are the penetration of cable in houses, going from about 44% in 1885 to about 83% by 2002. And then this line shows the average number of channels on each of these cable systems, going from just under 15 in 1985 to over 100 by 2002. So what we know this means is that the audiences become incredibly fragmented as they begin to watch not just the news, but they watch the Home Shopping Network or C-SPAN, or they watch the History Channel. They watch whatever they want to watch, and it turns out, surprise, surprise, not everyone wants to watch the news. And of course, cable is only the beginning. As the internet begins to spread and the number of sources explodes, what we have is fragmentation, again, like the fragmentation in the 19th century. Once again, we have fragmented media that is the way we get access to the truth about the world. And that has a dramatic effect on what people watched. Because those who were forced before to watch the news, forced because that's all that was on, they're not forced anymore. So they don't watch the news now. And those who do watch the news, the so-called news junkies, are partisan junkies. And that changes the business model of the broadcasters. A man like this wouldn't survive a week on modern cable television. Instead, the business model of today supports people like that, because partisan pays, and more partisan pays even more. I'm going to show you the scariest graph in America today. Hold your seats. You might want to look away if you're not really ready for terror. So here's the graph. This is the ideological content of the three major cable networks. So Fox, CNN, and MSNBC. And what this is saying is that until about the middle 2002, there's no difference between the three when you look at the ideological content of those three networks. But this is what happens after 2002. So the red line up at the top is Fox, becoming extraordinarily conservative. MSNBC drops to the bottom, and CNN can't decide where in the middle it wants to be. And this is because, as Roger Ailes knew when he started Fox News, the strategy for a news channel in a fragmented media environment is to find your base and play to your base. to further reinforce your base, your tribe, to keep them in their corners so you can reliably use them as your advertisers want. Now, of course, the internet only makes this worse. This extraordinary kid, Tristan Harris, who used to work as an engineer at Google, has left Google to start this Center for Humane Technology. And he's obsessed with the science of attention that these digital platforms are exploiting. Because these digital platforms use this science to engineer our attention, to overcome our natural resistance to what they're trying to give us. It's a kind of brain hacking, exploiting evolution and the way evolution has made us to force us to watch and consume what they give us. So whether it's the random rewards of the slot machine or the consequence of confronting endless wells of information, which means we cannot stop, as with eating popcorn, all of this is with the aim to sell ads. Okay, so we should just think about this for a second. That is the business model. And that business model, to sell ads, creates an incentive. The incentive is for them to know more about us. Not just by watching us, the way you could stand outside on a street and watch how many Volkswagens drive by, but by poking us or tweaking us or asking us or rendering us vulnerable. So in our vulnerability, our insecurity, we share more, reaching down the brain stack to leverage our insecurity, because the more we share, the more they can learn about us, and the more they can learn about us, the better they can sell ads to us. Zeynep Tufekci writes, the companies are in the business of monetizing attention, and not necessarily in ways that are conducive to health or success of social movements or the public sphere. Now, it turns out here, too, the politics of hate pays, because polarized and ignorant publics get riled up really easily. They get really passionately intent on whatever they're being told to do, and all of that helps them to sell ads. Okay, this is the point that kind of troubles me in a way that I don't quite know yet how to describe. Look, if you told me you were going to destroy democracy to end climate change, I wouldn't be for it, but I would get the trade-off. Or if you said, to end world hunger, we're going to break democracy, I'd be like, oh, it's too bad we have to break democracy, but I get ending world hunger is an important thing. But when you tell me that we're breaking democracy to make Mark richer, I don't even understand what the idea is. Yet this is what we have in effect allowed to happen, not intended. This is kind of like vaping for our democracy. We wake up and discover, oh my God, look at what it's doing to us, so that they can sell ads. About 2 months ago, Barack Obama said, if you watch Fox News, you're in one reality, and if you read the New York Times, you're in a different reality. And that's our reality. Yet because we are still legible, because they can still read us, this legible public has a kind of normative effect on our democratic process. My people say, representatives say, because the polls tell the representatives what the people believe. And whether the representative agrees with the people or not, he or she feels the pressure of what they say. So feel the pain of someone like Ben Sasse, who, I don't agree with his politics, but I think he's a very decent senator, who cannot be looking at what's going on and think to himself, this is the great ideal of either his party or the nation, but who is told every single day by his party what the people in Nebraska think about what's going on. The people in Nebraska who have been formed into these tribes, into these bubbles, into these separate realities, and told again and again what they need to think, and that reality constrains him, and he and others say, so what do I do now? Okay, all of this is very relevant to the fate of our 45th president, the almost third so far president to be impeached. Of course, the actual second impeached president was President Clinton. This almost third president to be impeached lives in this world where we live in different realities. So we hear different stories. These different stories will have a different effect on us. The idea that this will be what our evolution in this impeachment process will look like is just not true. It'll be something more like this, which is the graph showing the attitude of Republicans towards Donald Trump and the attitude of Democrats towards Donald Trump. These are two separate worlds. Like the president was speaking of when he said and invoked the idea of the Civil War, where two worlds had no idea of what the other one thought, which led, of course, to the tragedy of that conflict. So here, in this context, we have, again, a fragmented media, but we have a legible public which constrains what the representatives can do. So you can say that Johnson was impeached by an elite-driven process. Whether they got it right or wrong is another question. Nixon was impeached through a people-driven process because we, the people, all in some sense were there and we constrained as one what the Congress does. But I fear this president is going to be impeached in a crazies-driven process as these separate worlds that don't understand each other impose their very separate constraints on what our Congress does. This is the critical point to recognize. We have never been here before. We have never lived in a fragmented and polarized, yet heard or legible democracy before. This is just not part of our experience. And it raises a really profound question. How do you do democracy here? How do you do democracy when you cannot count on us all even understanding the same thing anymore? And when you realize we are not going back to the 1970s, that's just not going to happen. How do we construct a democracy when that's a reality? Okay, just let me say two more words and then I'm happy to take your questions. So when you look at this and you say, can we fix us? That part of the problem I've just described. The fact is I'm not sure. The book, which is available for purchase here today, has many ideas, but I confess that I'm not sure how far these ideas move us down the road to getting us a democracy we should be confident about. But I am absolutely convinced we can fix them. The extraordinarily inspirational act of the Congress, the House of Representatives, in passing H.R. 1, which was a package of reform, the most ambitious package of reforms passed by the House of Representatives since the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that is the model for fixing them. That bill would fix 80% of the problem with them. And so I think we should be talking about the equivalent in the presidential context, let's call it POTUS 1, a commitment by presidential candidates to pass fundamental reform first. And we at Equal Citizens have been polling and talking to these presidential candidates, and there are at least 9 of these candidates, including 3 of the front runners, who've made the commitment to enact fundamental reform like H.R. 1 or better first. Now, this I think we must try first, this change of them. I think we need to try a representative democracy first. We've never really had it in the history of America. Let's just try it and see if with a representative democracy we might begin to produce the movement that we need, not just on the endless list of problems that America must address, from climate change to healthcare to a future that will give our kids something to do, but also to the capacity to rebuild something we would feel respects the idea of a democracy. So about 12 years ago, in April 2008, candidate Obama spoke in Philadelphia. This is what he said. He said, we have to take up that fight, the fight to change the way Washington works. He said, if we're not willing to take up that fight, then real change that will make a lasting difference in the lives of ordinary Americans will keep getting blocked by the defenders of the status quo. He told us we must take up that fight. Now, one of the most exciting moments I've had as a parent is when my 16-year-old said to me, "Okay, boomer." Because I thought, wow, this is exactly what we need you people to turn on us. because you people need to realize we have let you down. And so when I look at this extraordinary president who was a friend and who I admire endlessly, I need to start by saying, though he told us we must take up the fight, he never took up that fight. He didn't introduce a single piece of legislation to address this deeply corrupted democracy, not even the legislation he promised to make it so presidential candidates could run with public funding again. He did not take up that fight. And so we need a generation to say to people like him and us, okay, boomer. You know, my grandfather was of the generation that Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation. What we boomers need to recognize is that we could well be the worst generation. Because while my grandfather's generation was willing to risk everything to build more for us, we can't even get it together to get a democracy to work again. But if we don't, it's not us who pay the price. It's those kids who say to us, okay, boomer. It's those kids who will suffer the consequences of climate change. Those kids who pay endlessly for healthcare that is too expensive and delivers too little. Those kids who have no future in the opportunity to work in an economy that has slowed to a stall for middle class. Those kids who pay the price because we can't do what our grandparents did. We must find a way to inspire these politicians to finally pull together the reform necessary to get us a democracy again, or if not again, at least for the first time. Thank you very much. So happy to take questions. I take it you're supposed to come to the mics. Or I'm a law professor, I could cold call on you. Yeah.
So a terrific and elegant presentation, Larry, thank you. I, like you, was extremely disappointed by Obama because of the gap between the promise and what happened. And I'm struck by the notion that he was the best of the worst case of somebody who had a chance to make and didn't make the change happen. It strikes me that there are so many incentives baked in to the current system, how Congress is compensated, how they run for office, all that other stuff, that, you know, more and more clever Band-Aids onto the current system, I'm skeptical about. Now, I know you've hung around in Silicon Valley a lot, and out there people talk about disrupting with technology. I mean, why shouldn't we instead think about trying to truly democratize our system, bypass representative government, and go to a truly individual person, you know, Athenian-style democracy to bypass all of the status quo, which is blockage upon blockage upon blockage.
Okay, so I don't agree with that. So excited! It's exciting to start with somebody I completely disagree with here, because I want to say, for all the reasons that I've just described about the problem with us, a direct democracy would be a disaster, right? Because we don't have time. That's what we pay them for. We don't have time to focus. I mean, maybe you and I do. Like, we love to think about policy wonkish-like issues. We read, we have a chance to deliberate about them. But 95% of America doesn't have that luxury. And they don't want that luxury. No, Madison, of course, looked at these ancient republics like Greece and recognized that when you have a large extended republic, you're not going to be able to function like that. Madison was a representative democracy guy. He was a Republican in a small r sense. And so I don't accept the idea that direct democracy would help. I think a real representative democracy would help. And I don't accept the idea that it would be a Band-Aid to change the way campaigns are funded. That would be fundamental. I think that is the critical first part of this POTUS 1 that has to happen. And then the question is, what makes it happen? And that goes back to the beginning, which of course I agree with you about, this depression about recognizing that the greatest of, you said the worst, I wouldn't call him the worst, but I would say the greatest of the opportunities we had in these last number of presidents for making real change, failed. Why? Well, I think the reason he failed is that he talked about reform until he beat Hillary Clinton in the primary. And once he beat Hillary Clinton, he stopped talking about reform. So the reform rhetoric was about beating the person who people thought was so closely associated with lobbyists and the Washington insiders and all that. And once he stopped, once he beat her, there's no reason to continue that, which means that when he was elected, people didn't look at him, except people like me, didn't look at him and say, he's going to change the way campaigns are funded. He's going to end gerrymandering. He's going to end vote suppression. That's just not what he was focused on. They thought he was going to get us Obamacare, get us climate change, and then we could go down the list of all the things he was going to get us. So I think it was a critical mistake that he didn't elevate this issue so that when he was elected, we knew the first thing he would do was to fix this democracy. Now, what terrifies me about that is the current presidential race, right? Because it is, on the one hand, astonishing that 9 candidates have said their promise is to make fundamental reform happen first. But the 5th presidential debate was the first time when the words public funding were uttered by a candidate on that stage. Bernie Sanders, God bless him, said we need public funding. But the point is, until we have candidates who are making fixing democracy first the thing they talk about first, and explaining to people, you know, if we change the way we fund elections, those guys won't be so committed to rewarding this tiny fraction of the 1% who fund their campaigns because you'd be funding their campaigns. So when Andrew Yang proposed, I thought a really genius, I mean, I'd written about it before, but a really genius idea for solving this problem, what he called democracy dollars, where you give everybody 100 democracy dollars, which they can then give to candidates running for office. Kirsten Gillibrand then upped that to $600, depending on how many federal races there were in your district. I thought that was enormously important because that begins to give people a clear sense of how it could be different. Seattle has that program. And in the last election in Seattle, Amazon came in and tried to capture city council by spending an enormous amount, not for them, but relative to what elections typically are in Seattle, to capture city council. But because they had these democracy vouchers, these candidates could resist Amazon's push, and they failed. Amazon failed to wipe out the independent city council in Seattle. So I think ideas like that, people need to begin to hear more about. And that will only happen if candidates start talking about it more. And if they talked about it more and they said again and again, look, my promise is the first thing I do to fundamentally reform, fix this democracy, first thing, and here's what that means, then maybe in January 2021, we will all look and say, okay, boomer, let's do it. Because that's what it's going to take for them to feel the pressure to do it. David.
In light of the divergence of the red and blue line in your graph, I would have expected you to say that fixing us is more important, maybe harder, but more important than fixing them. And one of the powerful points in your book is that the polls don't actually represent us very well. You don't have staffing for citizens to come together and deliberate and decide what they want. And my question for you is whether there's an opportunity to use social networks to create a voice of the people that is entitled to respect.
Yeah, so you're pointing to an intuition that I think is really powerful to understand the problem with us right now. In the classical Republican tradition, citizens are a public office. Just like judge or like president, citizens are a public office. So think of the other public offices in our system. When the president speaks, I mean, not this president, but when the president speaks, he doesn't blather. It's been he exclusively so far, but he doesn't just blather. What the president typically did, before this one at least, is when the president spoke, it was a consequence of reflection by a staff that had thought about both sides and given him all the information he needed to make a decision, and then he made a decision. If you walked up to Elena Kagan on the street and you quizzed her about admiralty law, she'd be perfectly entitled to say, I don't answer quizzes about admiralty law. You want to get a question about admiralty law answered? Get a case. Come to the court. Write some briefs. We'll have an argument. Then we'll reflect and we'll write an opinion. And then we'll give you our opinion about admiralty law. When a jury decides, you can't walk into the jury midway through and quiz them. The jury has a process for understanding the facts, which at the end they deliberate on and then give their view. All of these public officers have a process and they get staff, except us. We get called at 6 o'clock as we're making dinner and asked, what do you think of thorium reactors? Or should we renew NAFTA or not? And of course, we don't know what anybody's talking about. Or if we do, it's because we've watched it on Fox or MSNBC and we have our own little view of it. And of course, when we answer that question, it's not after we've been given information by our staff. We don't get staff. We don't get anything that those other public officers get. And I think we need a little bit of indignation. It's outrageous that we get rendered ridiculously while they get all the cushings of like really reflective, careful, deliberative policymaking. And so one consequence of that is to think, how do we build us into context of reflective policymaking? Social media might help that. I'm happy to experiment with it. But the kinds of examples we've seen that really work are things like what, there's been many experiments here in DC. Voice of the People is a great one. But in addition to that, I've been a real fan of Jim Fishkin's deliberative polling, which takes random representative samples of people, gives them information on both sides, gives them a chance to deliberate in small groups and big groups, maps them at the beginning, maps them at the end, and we see which direction the public is going. We need to multiply those so that we can begin to feel proud of ourselves again, because I think maybe you share this view too. When you see what we know, it's not surprising that statistic I quote in the book about the tiny proportion of Americans who actually believe that Americans can govern themselves, because we know we, right now, don't seem to be able to do that. Yes, sir.
The polling you talked about would be a different approach. I'm wondering about the media when you have such, as you showed, diverse there, and it's all about money. How do we inform people? And as you say, people are busy. So how do we inform them? And like, for example, climate change. How do we convince people, especially when we don't have a leader that's out there talking about it? So,
well, I think the first part that I'm saying is to recognize the unintended consequence of a certain business model for media. In fragmented media worlds, either cable or the internet, advertising is the business model we've embraced. But advertising has this perverse effect, at least in the dimension of democracy. Like when you turn to the culture channel, I love this world. I think this is a beautiful world. The diversity and the richness and the availability of stuff in the culture space is fantastic. But when you turn to the democracy space, that same presumption, that same platform and technology with that business model built in produces this kind of craziness. Now, that should encourage us to think about other kinds of platforms. This is along the line of David's question. So Jimmy Wales, who was one of the two people who originally started Wikipedia, has now launched a new social media platform, which is trying to be like Facebook, but will have no ads, like Wikipedia has no ads, and will have perfect guarantee for privacy. It won't be selling any of the private stuff, and wants to begin to encourage people. I think it's now up to about 500,000 who've joined in the last just 2 weeks, to move to this platform and to begin to have conversations in a platform where nobody has the technology to turn you crazy, to tweak you, to spike your drink so that they get more data so they can sell you better ads. And I think we need to ask ourselves, like, what is the right context in which to have political conversations? I talk in the book about what we could call the slow democracy movement. How many people have heard of the slow food movement? Right, so the slow food movement says, look, if you just cooked your own food and sat with your family and ate a dinner casually and slowly and talked over dinner, you'd be healthy, because you can't screw up food as well as the processed food industry does if you cook it yourself. And if you eat it slowly and reflectively, it actually is healthy in that way. So that's taking facts about our body and just telling us how to react to those facts to make it so that we can be nutritious. The slow democracy movement is the same thing, but applied to the mind. It's like we should recognize when we are good at talking and thinking about political ideas and when we are bad. So I've become a big fan of podcasts, because these are like 30-minute, hour-long, hour-and-a-half long, 2-hour long. I was on the Joe Rogan podcast at 2.5 hours. I looked up and was like, whoa, have we been here 2.5 hours? And he says, everybody listens all the way to the end. And so the point is, if you sit there and listen for 2 hours to people talking about ideas, You reflect on it differently than how you do if you get a tweet or if you get some spiked Facebook news feed post that again riles you up and then forces you to respond in some aggressive way. And so here too, I think we need to become reflective about how we live our life as small d Democrats. Where do we engage in that kind of speech? And how do we encourage the environments that would make it so what's produced is not as poisonous as what we see right now? Yes, sir.
Hi. You mentioned Franklin Roosevelt and the media environment at that time, but he also had labor unions and other grassroots movement. Now today we have grassroots movements building. We have Fight for 15, Black Lives Matter. We have Bernie Sanders founded Our Revolution, 800 chapters running people for every office. And we have, in the House tonight, we have Wolfpack and other democracy workers. So what do you think of that element of people who are put upon by the 0.02%, organizing themselves? And after all, that's sort of slow democracy, too, when they meet face-to-face and do that work. And then also, with respect to the campaign finance reform, what do you think about H.R. 1 versus an amendment we need to guard against a rogue Supreme Court? So,
of course, I am inspired by these grassroots movements. The last chapter of the book talks about 3 of them. One, Katie Fahey in Michigan, which, this is a 20-something who just posted a Facebook post saying, anybody interested in taking on partisan gerrymandering in Michigan? And within a couple months had 4,000 volunteers, and a couple months after that had 400,000 signatures on a ballot petition, then ran a campaign that spent more than $15 million to win with more than 60% in Michigan this reform to end partisan gerrymandering. Those things are incredibly exciting and incredibly inspiring. But at the federal level, I feel like we need to recognize that those efforts would be 1,000 times more effective if we didn't have a corrupted government that they had to fight. So like you get a climate change movement going and people get rallied and excited about how to get the government to do the right thing, and they try to tell people about the carbon fee or dividends, which I am all for. It's a wonderful idea. But the reality is everything we do, they can do 10 times more effectively given the corruption of this current system. So this is why I think at some point we have to step back and say, okay, look, pause. We have to fix the democracy if we're going to get from the democracy what the people actually want. And if we don't have the discipline to recognize that as a people, if we can't sort of all of us like come to this recognition, I fear we won't fix it. I fear we're not going to get these things people are so passionate and fighting about. Instead, we spin and spiral into even greater anger as we are outraged at the even most obvious things that our government can't do. Because our government can't do anything right now. It's a failed institution because of a failed Congress at the core of this republic.
Amendment versus?
Amendment, okay, so to get an amendment requires 38 states to agree with it. If you passed H.R. 1, or my view, if you passed Kirsten Gillibrand's public funding voucher proposal, you would make it 1,000 times easier to imagine passing an amendment to the Constitution, because then you wouldn't have the money driving so far against that kind of change. So it's a sequencing question in my mind. The first step ought to be getting a clean Congress. And then a clean Congress is more likely to move to the right kind of amendment. Now, the Wolfpack people here, I want to acknowledge and praise, because there are many people who think Congress is going to give us the amendments we need. You know, many people believe in the tooth fairy too. The reality is the framers of our Constitution envisioned a corrupted, broken Congress. George Mason on the floor of the convention 4 days before the Constitution was finished said, hey, what if Congress is the problem? Because at that point, the only way to amend the Constitution was for Congress to amend it. And they gave us another way to amend it. Article 5 has a convention provision that allows 34 states to call for a convention, and that convention gets to propose amendments. So I think the only way to get amendments proposed that will be ultimately successful will be through that process. But even those amendments have to be ratified by 38 states, and 38 is a huge number in this democracy.
I just want to point out we have time for 2 more questions.
Oh, Sorry. Yes, sir.
So I guess I'm pretty pessimistic about a lot of the things. I appreciate the way you lay them out, but for some of the things that have been pointed out before, for instance, Obama and others, they operate within a certain context, which is, it seems, irreversible, right? And so Obama expended a lot of political capital trying to do healthcare, and the other things that he could have brought to bear, he was limited. And then the other things that you laid out in terms of attention span and things of that nature, those aren't really sexy items to bring to bear in a campaign. So it seems like we have this whole unholy cocktail of different elements. You have a lot of moneyed interest that are very sophisticated and discreet and can kind of withstand any public kind of countervailing force against their interest, right? So in terms of a public funding bill, things of that nature, they're going to be there, right? So Amazon, for instance, they could outlast the socialist who won and be there for the next time, right? So I guess my question is, and I think you've hinted at it here or there, and it may be in the book, can you give us some nuggets of hope in terms of how this, it's an unholy mix, right? And so, for instance, Facebook caters to our interests of like wanting to do things. And so, how do you get out of the vicious cycle?
Yeah. So, as Harvey Milk used to say, you've got to give them hope. So let me first give you hope, and then I want to tell you you should stop looking for hope. So first, give you hope. Look, it is astonishing that 9 candidates for president, 3 of the top 5, have said they will make fundamental reform the first thing they do. We've never seen that. Never seen that. And if we can find a way to get our media and get all of us to force them to talk about it, there's a 5% chance it'll happen. That's huge. That's 100 times more than at any point in our past. So I think there's a reason to be incredibly optimistic. I'm more optimistic now than at any time in the last 12 years I've been fighting this fight. And I think everybody should be optimistic, and we should act on that optimism. But then I want to tell you why you should stop believing in the luxury of hope. So I'm going to tell you a story I wrote in my first book about a time I spoke at Dartmouth, and a woman stood up and she said to me, "Okay, Professor, you've convinced me it's hopeless. There's nothing we can do." And as I told it in this story, when she said that to me, I thought, okay, this is a failure. What do I do now? And for some reason, I haven't asked my shrink about this yet, but for some reason in my head at that moment was the image of my then 6-year-old son. And I thought, what if a doctor said to me, your son has terminal brain cancer and there's nothing you can do? Would I do nothing? Would I just accept it? Would I say, I have no reason to hope, so I'm just going to give up? And then I had the obvious thought, which is that's what love means. Love means the odds don't matter. I don't give a damn what the odds are when you tell me my son is sick. I'm going to do everything I can until I can't do anything more because I love him with everything in my heart. And then I thought, even we liberals love our country. Even we liberals love our country. And we should stop allowing ourselves the luxury of doing nothing because we rationally figure out that the chances of winning are almost zero. We love our traditions. As awful as our history has been, we love the ideals that speak in our tradition. And we need to make them real. And we can. We are so close. More close now than I think we've ever been. I think you get the last question. It better be good.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor, for being here. And even liberals, forget about it. We don't have anything to apologize for. Broader question. No, seriously. I challenge the even there.
That was a joke.
Okay.
Obviously.
Oh, sorry. I get it. Explain the paradox of a media that is supposed to be mainstream, liberally inclined, whatever it is characterized as, certainly not neutral and objective, and it's not watched nearly as much, regarded as partisan. How do you square that with a 24/7 coverage of Trump that's driving people away from the news, including us, even liberals, away from? the media.
You know, if it were, they wouldn't be doing it.
So explain it. What's going on?
Well,
Is it
I think what's going
ratings or
on.
just- yeah.
No. They're driving towards. Depends on who they are, right? So like, people on my side are like, really disgusted by what's happening, but really inspired by a bunch that we've seen, and eager to see this story unfold in a way that brings to the forefront what we think is true. I think the other side is watching the characterization of what's going on. And the characterization of what's going on is that it's a bunch of crazy people on my side who are just turning this nation upside down because they're still trying to relitigate.
Whose characterization? Isn't it supposed to be we are the liberal mainstream media?
No,
Whose
but
characterization?
you don't believe that.
No, I don't. But just who?
Okay, but
I
nobody
wasn't
here
clear on
believes
what you were
that.
saying. I just
my
wasn't
whole
clear.
point is that was that scary graph. My whole point is we have these worlds that are separate now. If I think conservatives in the 1970s had a point. Media did seem mainstream liberal. You could say it seemed mainstream true, but seemed mainstream liberal, okay? And they wanted to fight against it. I get that. And they have, and this is a free society with the First Amendment, and that's what gets to happen.
I just wonder why they cover Trump so much.
Well, because they love Trump. It's giving them what they need here.
So it's
Right?
not. So
They're not
it's not so
seeing-
simple. It's not as simple
It's
as
not
they are
simple.
mainstream, but there's
No.
Yeah. Okay.
No. They see what they want to see. We
Yeah.
see what we want to see.
It seems like
That's
it's
all-
really self-defeating if we rely on them to be agents, right? If we regard them as partisan, they're not news, they're partisan, they're disappointing us.
Okay, but what I'm saying, and this is maybe the most depressing point. We grew up in a time when we kind of imagined there was this ideal of, an objective news out there. And I wish it were. I wish it were. It's not going to be. There will be objective news, and we should be encouraging and supporting it. But the reality is, in this fragmented media environment, we've seen the business model since the beginning of time.
If only you were right. If only people
For the
dropped
sake of
false
time, you're
equilibration.
going to have to ask
That's the
for
problem.
this question to get cut.
We have to do D's and R's 50-50 is the problem. That's the media perspective, right?
Now you've lost me. But maybe
In the sense that we have to cover things neutrally. And so
all I'm saying is we are not going.
rely on them to be our agents. And they need to be neutral.
Thank you all
very
for
much.
coming.